ever imagined yourself standing in front of a wild, impassable river, knowing that on the other side lies your great destiny? But that destiny is protected by giant walls and ruthless warriors. This is the situation of one of the greatest leaders who ever lived. Today, we are going to dive into an epic story of supreme courage, brilliant military strategies, and a faith capable of toppling the thickest walls ever built. If you know absolutely nothing about the Bible or its ancient history, do not worry at all. This video was made exactly for you. Get ready to be transported back in time to the ancient Middle East, where an ordinary man was given the most incredibly impossible mission in human history. And you will discover how his tactics and challenges still resonate in the battles we face today. We are talking about a distant era, more than 3,000 years ago, in a ruthless and hostile world. Imagine an entire nation of newly freed slaves, a group of millions of Israelites who spent 40 long years wandering through a scorching desert, something as vast and desolate as the famous Death Valley. They are exhausted, with calloused feet and tested spirits, and the greatest leader they have ever had in their entire history, the legendary Moses, has just passed away. The leadership and the destiny of this entire nation now fall heavily on the shoulders of a man named Joshua. He is an experienced war general and a man with unshakable faith. The goal for Joshua and his people is to cross the border and conquer Canaan, the famous Promised Land, a land said to be flowing with milk and honey. But this land is not empty and waiting for them. It is inhabited by brutal warrior nations, fearsome giants, and cities fortified to the teeth. Therefore, Joshua must quickly transform a people of tired nomads into the most disciplined and courageous army the world has ever seen, preparing them for the greatest war of their lives. And Joshua's great journey begins with a direct and divine promise that no one would be able to defeat him in battle. But right from the start, the first major barrier standing before them is the famous city of Jericho, a colossal fortress and considered absolutely impenetrable at the time, with walls so unbelievably thick that people literally built their houses inside them. Therefore, Joshua decides to act strategically and secretly sends 2 spies to evaluate the city's imposing defenses. And the spies manage to infiltrate the enemy city under the cover of night, and they find shelter in the house of a woman named Rahab. But the border guards notice the movement, and the king of Jericho quickly discovers there are Israelite intruders in the city, sending his most cruel soldiers to capture them immediately. Therefore, Rahab, who had already heard about the victories and miracles of the God of Israel and believed in him in the depths of her heart, makes a life or death decision, hiding the spies under stalks of flax on the roof of her house and lying to misdirect the king's guards. And in exchange for her risking everything to save their lives, the spies solemnly swear to spare the lives of Rahab and her entire family on the day the city is attacked and destroyed. But for the army of Israel to even reach Jericho, they first have to face the fury of nature and cross the dreaded Jordan River. And the river is exactly at its peak flood stage, overflowing its banks violent and deadly waters. Therefore, God gives Joshua a very clear instruction that required pure faith. The priests were to carry the sacred Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders and march straight into the water, taking the first step into the turbulent currents before any miracle happened. And the very moment the soles of the priests' feet touch the edge of the raging waters, the entire river stops flowing, and the water piles up like a great invisible wall far away. But the people still needed to cross quickly before the divine dam gave way, walking across a completely dry riverbed. Therefore, thousands of Israelites cross in safety, and Joshua orders the raising of a great monument of 12 heavy stones in the middle of the river, and another on the bank, so that future generations would never forget that impossible miracle. And now Israel is finally camped inside enemy territory, ready for the imminent battle. But before any physical war, they needed to renew their spiritual covenant. As all the men born during the 40 years in the desert had not yet undergone the ritual of commitment to their God. Therefore, they pause the military advance, and all the men are subjected to a painful ritual of consecration, which leaves them vulnerable to an enemy attack for several days. And after recovering and celebrating their first great feast of liberation in the new land, Joshua goes out to observe the formidable walls of Jericho up close. But suddenly, he encounters a mysterious man standing in front of him with a drawn sword glinting in the sun. Therefore, Joshua, with the instinct of a warrior, runs to him and asks if he is an ally or an enemy. And the celestial being replies that he is neither, but rather the commander of the army of the Lord. And he reveals to Joshua the strangest and most unconventional battle plan in military history. But the plan did not involve arrows, swords, or giant battering rams to break down the gates. Therefore, Joshua has to convince his entire war-focused army to simply march in total and absolute silence around the city for 6 days straight, only listening to the sound of 7 priests blowing trumpets made of ram's horns. And the citizens of Jericho watch terrified and confused as the Israelite army circles their walls and returns to camp without firing a single arrow. But the 7th day arrives, the decisive day and the peak of tension. Therefore, they wake up at dawn and, this time, march around the impenetrable fortress not just once, but 7 consecutive times. And on the 7th lap, when the trumpets sound with a deafening volume, Joshua orders the people to release the loudest war cry their lungs could handle. But solid stone walls do not usually give way to the sound of human voices. Therefore, in an event that defies logic and physics, the foundations of the earth shake and the massive walls of Jericho collapse inward, crumbling into a cloud of suffocating dust and allowing the Israelites to enter the city without any barrier and conquer it totally, sparing only the heroine Rahab and her family, exactly as they had promised. And Joshua's fame spreads like wildfire through the entire region, causing terror among the neighboring kings. But in the midst of this stunning glory, there was a dark problem forming within Israel's own camp. An Israelite soldier named Achan decided to secretly disobey God's direct order which required all the treasures of Jericho to be consecrated and not looted for personal use. Therefore, driven by greed, Achan hid a luxurious robe, silver, and a bar of gold under the earth in the middle of his own tent. And without knowing about the hidden crime, Joshua confidently sends a small detachment of only 3,000 soldiers to take the next city, a small fortress called Ai. But, to the total shock and despair of Joshua and Israel, the small armies of Ai do not just resist. They massacre the Israelite soldiers and drive them out in a humiliating and terrifying defeat. Therefore, the heart of all the people of Israel melts with fear, and Joshua falls with his face to the ground, crying out to the heavens to understand why they were abandoned after such a perfect victory. And the divine answer is harsh and clear. Someone in the camp had broken the rules of war and brought a curse upon all the people. But finding a single guilty man in the middle of millions of people would be like finding a needle in a colossal haystack. Therefore, Joshua organizes a tense lottery ceremony the next day, tribe by tribe, family by family, until fate points undeniably to Achan, and Achan confesses his crime of selfish greed. But the damage to the nation was already done. Lives had been lost in battle because of his disobedience. Therefore, Achan and everything that belonged to him face a severe and final punishment, being banished and destroyed in the valley that would be known forever as the Valley of Trouble, thus restoring justice and order to the camp. And with morale restored and the camp purified, Israel was ready to try again. But attacking the city of Ai a second time required more than just brute force. It required tactical intelligence, since the enemy now thought they were invincible. Therefore, Joshua devises a brilliant and perfectly calculated military trap. He sends a large part of his best warriors during the night to hide behind the city in a silent ambush. And the next morning, Joshua marches head-on with the rest of the army toward the city gates. But as soon as the king of Ai sees the Israelites, he arrogantly comes out with all his soldiers to crush them again, leaving the city completely open and unprotected. Therefore, Joshua and his frontline men pretend to panic and start running toward the desert, luring the enemy army far away from their fortress. And at the exact moment, Joshua lifts his spear to the heavens, and the hidden warriors invade the empty city, setting it on fire and trapping the enemies in a devastating two-pronged attack, ensuring a crushing and brilliant victory. And the news that Israel was now using advanced tactics beyond miracles spreads widespread panic among the nations of Canaan. But a shrewd group called the Gibeonites realizes that fighting Joshua was a pure death sentence. Therefore, they decide to use the art of deception instead of war. They put on ragged clothes and patched shoes, put moldy and dry bread in their backpacks, and march to the camp of Israel, pretending to be ambassadors from an extremely distant and peaceful country. And Joshua receives them, but in a rare moment of overconfidence, he and his leaders make a decision based only on appearances and do not consult divine wisdom on the matter. Therefore, they sign an unbreakable peace treaty with the mysterious foreigners, promising never to attack them, And only 3 days after this diplomatic ceremony, the shocking truth comes to light. But the Gibeonites were not from far away. They were neighbors, local inhabitants of Canaan who were supposed to be fought. Therefore, Joshua is furious at the blatant lie. But his word, given in the name of his God, was sacred and could not be broken, forcing them to spare the lives of the Gibeonites and turn them into perpetual servants of the Israelite camp, tasked with cutting wood and carrying water. And this unusual peace alliance triggers a domino effect of chaos in the region. The king of Jerusalem, upon hearing that the Gibeonites allied with Israel, is furious and terrified by this betrayal. But he knows he cannot attack the Gibeonites alone. Therefore, he calls for a massive coalition of 5 powerful southern kings and their huge combined armies, marching to crush the Gibeonites and send a bloody message of power. And the Gibeonites, desperate, send an urgent message to Joshua asking for help and pleading for him to honor the peace treaty they had made. But the enemy forces together form a sea of formidable warriors that threaten to overwhelm Israel's forces. Therefore, Joshua does not hesitate for a second. He makes his army march all night, without rest, and attacks them by surprise at dawn, causing deep panic in the ranks of the 5-king alliance. And the enemy begins to flee in total disorder through the Rocky Mountains. But they were still too numerous and threatened to escape and regroup to counterattack in the future. Therefore, the heavens open and God launches an apocalyptic rain of huge hailstones on the fleeing enemy soldiers, striking down more adversaries than the swords of the Israelites themselves. And the battle rages furiously throughout the day. But the sun begins to drop dangerously on the horizon. But if night fell, the darkness would give the enemy the perfect cover to escape and grow stronger. Therefore, in the most epic and incomprehensible moment in all of biblical history, Joshua raises his voice before the entire army of Israel and gives a direct command to the cosmos itself. He commands the sun to stand still over the city of Gibeon and the moon not to move in the valley of Ajalon. And in a miracle that defies all the laws of astrophysics, the sun literally parks in the middle of the sky, and the day is extended for almost 24 additional hours, giving Joshua the light necessary to completely annihilate the enemy forces until the southern threat was extinguished forever. And after brilliantly conquering the entire southern region, peace finally seemed within reach. But the news of these terrifying victories reaches the ears of the king of Hazor, the most powerful ruler in northern Canaan. He calls for the largest enemy coalition ever assembled, an army so vast it looked like the sand on the seashore, equipped with thousands of war horses and deadly iron chariots with blades on the wheels, the weapon of mass destruction of that ancient era. Therefore, the threat is now existential. If Israel lost this battle, the entire nation would be instantly decimated, and the promised land would be lost forever. And the iron chariots seemed impossible to fight by an infantry army fighting on foot in open ground. But Joshua is instructed by God not to be afraid of enemy war technologies and to attack quickly and brutally. Therefore, using the element of surprise once again. The army of Israel falls suddenly upon the northern forces at the waters of Merom, even before they could mount their chariots and organize for battle, crushing the largest military force on the continent and burning their fearsome war chariots to ashes. And finally, after years and years of intense military campaigns, blood, sweat, and miracles, the major part of the active war of conquest ends. But Joshua's mission was far from finished, as the vast land they had conquered now needed to be fairly and meticulously divided among the 12 tribes of Israel. Therefore, a long and exhausting diplomatic and geographic process of land distribution begins, involving ancient maps, divine casting of lots, and the resolution of constant internal disputes. And during this division, Joshua's old companion, an elderly warrior of 85 years named Caleb, approaches him. But Caleb does not want a peaceful and easy-to-farm piece of land for his retirement. Therefore, he boldly demands to receive the mountains of Hebron, exactly the area inhabited by the remaining warrior giants, proving that the fierce spirit and tireless faith of that generation had not weakened with old age. And Caleb sets off to clear the mountains of their last enemies, and the land is duly divided. Cities of refuge are strategically established to ensure justice and asylum for people accused of accidental crimes. And the Levites, the tribe of priests, receive their own sacred cities scattered throughout the nation. But time is ruthless to all great heroes, and Joshua is now at an extremely advanced age, feeling that his final days on earth are approaching quickly. Therefore, he summons all the leaders, chiefs, judges, and officials of Israel for a final and emotional speech, a monumental farewell that would shape the nation's future for centuries. And in this speech, he reminds them of all the miraculous faithfulness of God since the time of Abraham, through Moses in Egypt, to the incredible victories they themselves had experienced. But he knows the human heart and knows how easily they can forget all of this and be seduced by the pagan gods and cultures of the peoples that still remained in the land. Therefore, Joshua issues a powerful and unforgettable ultimatum to the entire nation, a phrase that echoes through the corridors of history to this day. He says that if they think it is bad to serve the true God, then let them choose on that very day whom they will serve. But he strikes his chest with the firmness of a timeless leader and declares with absolute passion, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And inspired by this magnetic leadership until his last breath, all the people solemnly swear an unbreakable loyalty, sealing a new covenant under a great sacred tree. We thus conclude the incredible saga of Joshua, a brutally honest story about the horrors and tactical genius of ancient warfare. But at its core, it is not just a military manual or a book of bloodshed. Therefore, the book of Joshua remains a powerful, timeless testimony to the colossal importance of keeping unshakable faith when the odds are absolutely impossible. It is about facing the impassable walls of your own life and believing that, with obedience and the right support, even the most fearsome giants can fall. Joshua was not just a conqueror of territories. He was a man who guided his entire people from a past of trauma and slavery to a bright future of freedom and prosperity in a home of their own. The promised land was conquered, but the challenge of maintaining focus and gratitude was the next great war they would need to fight every single day. And so the chapter of this extraordinary commander closes, leaving us with the unforgettable question: what walls do you need to face today? And which side of history will you choose?